Hello and welcome to ThePrint. This is Bidisha and you're watching Economics. Let me start with a simple question. When a former chief economic advisor keeps returning to the same argument 6 years later across papers, interviews, and now a new book, it's usually not because he enjoys controversy. It's because he thinks the question still matters. In recent weeks, Dr. Arvind Subramanian has revived a claim he first made back in 2019 that India's GDP growth, particularly after 2011, may have been overstated, possibly by as much as 2 to 2.5 percentage points a year. Now that sounds explosive, it sounds political, and it sounds like a challenge to official statistics. But beneath the headlines, this is actually a much more technical and much more interesting debate. Because at its core, this is not a fight about whether India is growing, it's a question about how we know that it is. Now, the question is, what was Subramanian actually saying? Let's first clear up a misconception. Dr. Subramanian's 2019 paper was not just a casual comparison between GDP and a few indicators. It wasn't GDP says 7%, electricity says 4%, therefore GDP is wrong. What he did was far more structured. He asked a very specific question. Did India's GDP start behaving differently after a specific breakpoint around 2011-12 compared both to its own past and to other countries? That year matters because 2011-12 is when India rebased GDP, changed methodology, shifted data sources, especially for the corporate sector. To test this, Dr. Subramanian used something economists call a difference in differences approach. Now let me translate this into plain English. What is exactly this difference in differences approach? This is basically a before and after compared to others test. Think of it like this. First, look at India before 2011. GDP growth broadly moved with things like electricity use, trade, freight, fuel, credit. Then look at India after 2011. GDP growth stayed strong, but many of these indicators weakened. Now comes the crucial step. Compare this change not just within India, but against other countries during the same period. If global factors like slower world trade or energy efficiency were responsible, we should see similar breaks elsewhere. Subramanian found that India's divergence was unusually large. That extra gap is what led him to say this is statistically odd and it deserves some explanation. Importantly, he did not say this was a proof of manipulation. He just called it an anomaly. And this is exactly where critics pushed back. They said, your method assumes that the relationship between GDP and these indicators should stay stable over time. And that exactly brings us to a very important concept, stationarity. In simple terms, a stationary relationship means variables move together in a fairly stable way over time. A non-stationary relationship, on the other hand, means that link changes as the economy evolves. In plain English, what worked as a proxy in a manufacturing economy may completely stop working in a services or digital-heavy economy. Electricity use, freight movement, fuel consumption, these are goods-based indicators. If growth increasingly comes from software, finance, healthcare, logistics platforms, digital services, then it might leave a smaller physical footprint. So a breakdown in correlation does not automatically mean GDP is wrong. It may simply mean the economy has changed. This is a serious and valid critique. Economies don't just grow, they transform. But here's where things get more nuanced. Structural change can weaken relationships. It rarely erases them everywhere at once. Services still use electricity, occupy offices, borrow money, employ people, generate spending. So when divergences show up simultaneously across energy, trade, transport, and credit, it raises a legitimate question. Not an accusation, a question. And more importantly, the non-stationarity argument explains exactly why old indicators may fail. But it doesn't answer the next question. If these indicators no longer work, what should replace them? That's where the debate stalled. India got stuck in a binary frame. Either trust the GDP completely or distrust it entirely. That is the wrong frame. Let's look at electricity first. What this chart shows is very important. Electricity consumption still reacts to reality. It falls during crisis, it rebounds during recoveries. That means the indicator hasn't really broken. But after 2011, GDP growth often appears stronger relative to the electricity growth. The divergence is not about direction, it's about magnitude. This is the original puzzle Dr. Subramanian pointed to. Now let's test the rebuttal. If growth has shifted away from goods, does it show up in exports? Exports as a share of GDP rose steadily through the 2000s and early 2010s. Then they plateaued. Yet, GDP growth remained robust in several later years. This doesn't really mean growth must be export-led to be real. But it does tell us that growth isn't being strongly validated through tradables either. So neither physical activity nor exports fully close the loop. So now we move to something entirely new, UPI. UPI transactions barely existed before 2017. Since then, they've exploded from under 100 crore transactions to over 13,000 crore. This chart shows two things clearly. Number one, digital transaction intensity has grown exponentially. Number two, GDP growth, by contrast, moves within a much narrower band and even contracts in 2020. This does not validate GDP and it does not invalidate it either. What it does show instead is that large parts of today's economy operate through channels that older indicators never captured. This data simply did not exist when earlier GDP debates were happening. Now it's worth pausing here to make an important point about how the same statistical tool, difference in differences, can also tell a very positive story. Think about UPI. Before 2016, India looked like most other emerging economies. Digital payments existed, but they were fragmented, limited, and niche. After UPI, something changed. Yes, digital payments grew everywhere. But in India, they grew far faster and at a much larger scale than global trends alone would predict. That gap, the extra acceleration, is exactly what a difference in differences approach is designed to capture. In simple terms, if you compare India before and after UPI and compare that change to the other countries over the same period, you see a clear treatment effect. India's digital transaction intensity did not just rise, it structurally shifted. This does not prove that GDP growth is overstated or understated, but it does show something very important. When India builds large-scale digital public infrastructure, the economic signal shows up clearly and unmistakably in the data. The irony is that the same statistical method used to question GDP growth also confirms one of India's quietest successes: the creation of a digital payments backbone that transformed how the economy functions. So what is the solution? Not choosing sides. The solution is not defending GDP blindly, not distrusting it reflexively. The answer is validation through a dashboard. A modern economy needs modern cross-checks. That means services indicators like PMIs, air travel, telecom usage. Number 2, digital signals like UPI, e-way bills, platform activity. Number 3, formalization markers like GST filings and payroll data. Number 4, labor indicators, jobs, wages, hours worked. And then finally, we also have independent checks that need to be done, like satellite nighttime lights. No single indicator is decisive, but taken together, they tell us whether growth is broadly consistent with the lived reality. Seen this way, Subramanian's renewed intervention is not an attack on institutions. It is a reminder of unfinished business. India's statistical system has evolved before and it can evolve again. The credibility of growth numbers does not rest on insisting that they are beyond question, but on showing that they hold up to scrutiny from multiple angles. A confident economy does not fear validation, it builds it. And doing so would not weaken India's growth story, it would strengthen it.